Hello dear listener, please subscribe to our channel. Enjoy watching. You know how you always hear stories of people who find out their partner's cheating, and they either throw a fit, walk out, or forgive them because it's the right thing to do. Yeah, that's not me. Not even close. When I found out my wife, Emily, was cheating, I didn't go through the usual motions. I didn't cry or lose sleep or beg for an explanation. No. I got mad, really mad, but I didn't let on. I let that anger sink in, and then I thought, why let her get off easy? Let me back up a bit, tell you how it all started. Emily and I had been married for almost 10 years. Now, I'll be the first to admit marriage isn't easy, but we had a good thing going, or at least I thought we did. She was beautiful, smart, had a good sense of humor, and kept me on my toes. I loved her, and I thought she loved me. But then, there were these little things. You know, those things that seem insignificant until they're not? That's where it started. I'd come home, and the house would smell like cologne, only it wasn't mine. Or she'd be out late with the girls, which she'd never done much before, and her phone would start buzzing with messages she didn't bother to hide but never showed me. I tried to ignore it at first, thinking I was just overreacting, but the feeling that something was wrong was like a splinter in my brain. It itched, and no amount of rationalizing made it go away. I brought it up with my buddy Mike. You know Mike, the guy who thinks every problem can be solved with a couple of beers and a good laugh. I told him my suspicions, and he just chuckled and slapped me on the back. You're getting paranoid, buddy, he said, laughing it off. But that didn't ease the feeling. If anything, it made it worse. Finally, one Friday night, I decided to follow her. Emily told me she was meeting up with the girls, just like she'd been saying for weeks now, but this time, I had a feeling in my gut that tonight would give me answers. She drove across town, to the shadier part of it, where you wouldn't expect to find your typical upscale girls' night out. She parked outside a dimly lit bar that I'd never even heard her mention. And then she just waited. And that's when I saw him, a guy in a shiny red sedan, maybe my age but dressed like he was still in his 20s. Emily smiled and climbed into his car. They sat there, laughing and kissing, like I wasn't sitting in my car in the shadows, watching them betray me in real time. You'd think I'd explode or want to pull her out by her hair, but honestly, I just sat there, completely numb. I knew right then and there that my marriage was over. But instead of walking away, a plan started to form in my mind, a way to make her feel what I was feeling right then, only 10 times worse. I was going to play the part of the perfect husband while planning the ultimate revenge. A betrayal for a betrayal. The next day, I was all smiles, even woke up early to make her breakfast. She looked at me, almost suspicious, like she could feel something was off. But I was careful. I didn't ask questions or hint that I knew anything. I just kept smiling, all while digging into her life behind the scenes. I followed her a few more times, tracking where they'd meet up. I found out his name was Dan, a gym trainer from a few towns over, and started piecing together their schedule. I even joined his gym, pretending I wanted to get back in shape. He took to me quickly, probably feeling like I was a harmless guy just trying to impress his wife. It took every ounce of self-control to keep a straight face when he offered me tips on weightlifting and diet. All the while, I was planning the moment I'd drop the hammer. After a few weeks, I had everything I needed, their routine, some photos, and enough dirt to bury them both. The next step was to lure them into my trap, and for that, I needed a remote location, a cabin, to be exact. I suggested to Emily that we take a weekend getaway, just the two of us. Her eyes lit up at the idea, and I knew exactly what she was thinking, a whole weekend to herself, a break from lying and sneaking around. But I could see right through her, and I knew she'd call Dan the second I was out of sight. We drove up to a secluded cabin I'd rented in the mountains, a place so far from civilization you could scream your lungs out, and no one would hear. On the way there, she seemed uneasy, maybe sensing that something was up, but I played it cool. When we arrived, I pretended to get a call from work, an emergency that would take me a few hours. I told her I'd be back by nightfall, left her with the cabin keys, and drove off. Of course, I didn't go far. I parked a ways down the road and waited. Like clockwork, Dan showed up about 30 minutes later. I watched from my car as he got out, looking around like some kind of spy, before letting himself in. They didn't waste any time getting comfortable, pouring wine, laughing like teenagers. And as they did, I was recording every second of it on the hidden cameras I'd set up around the cabin. After a couple of hours, I decided it was time for the main event. I crept up to the cabin door, unlocked it as quietly as I could, and walked right in on them. You should have seen the looks on their faces, like two kids caught with their hands in the cookie jar. Emily went white as a sheet, stammering, trying to come up with some excuse, but I didn't give her the chance. "Save it," I said, keeping my voice calm. "I know everything. I've known for weeks." Dan tried to look tough, maybe thinking he could intimidate me, but I just laughed. "You think you're the first guy to mess with a married woman? Let me tell you, there's a reason I know exactly how to handle someone like you." And that's when I showed them the video footage I'd been taking. Their eyes widened as I laid out my conditions. I told them the only way they'd walk out of this without their faces splashed across every social media platform I could think of was if they followed my instructions exactly. They nodded, silent and scared, probably wondering what I was going to ask them to do. I told them we were going to do something symbolic, a ritual to bury the old life, and they were going to help me. I handed Dan a shovel and told him to start digging out in the woods, about 50 feet from the cabin. He glanced at Emily, who just stared back, speechless, and started digging. I watched as he broke a sweat, taking out shovel after shovel of dirt, getting deeper and deeper, until the pit was wide and deep enough for my next phase of the plan. Then I made them stand there, looking down into that hole. I told them I'd created a fake paper trail of debts in both of their names, complete with forged signatures and all kinds of incriminating evidence, linking them to everything from fraud to theft. I made it clear that if they ever crossed me, I'd make sure they both went down for it. They were shocked into silence, standing there as I calmly told them I was leaving them there, with no phones, no cars, and only each other for company. When I walked out of those woods, leaving them staring at that hole in the ground, I knew they wouldn't follow me. They were too afraid of what else I might have up my sleeve, and they were already beginning to turn on each other. On the drive back home, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, relief. The way I saw it, they deserved each other. And if they ever tried to come back, I'd be ready, with everything I needed to bury them for real this time. You'd think that after all that, catching Emily red-handed, watching her crumble, leaving her and Dan stranded out there with only their own betrayal to keep them company, I'd be done. But the truth is, the anger didn't fade as easily as I'd hoped. The satisfaction didn't last. It was like a bad itch that only got worse as the weeks went by. I tried to settle back into my old life, acting like everything was fine. My friends didn't know the truth, of course. Mike was still calling me to hang out, cracking jokes about me going off the grid after Emily's disappearance. I laughed along with him, making up stories about how Emily had left for some kind of spiritual retreat after our split, which he bought without a second thought. No one suspected a thing. I played the part of the devastated husband so well, I could have won an Oscar. But something was off. It felt like a shadow was following me. I'd be doing something mundane, like brushing my teeth or taking out the trash, and suddenly feel this creeping unease. I'd look over my shoulder, half expecting to see Emily or Dan standing there, their eyes accusing, their faces twisted with anger. I started having nightmares, vivid ones where they were calling my name from that cabin, their voices echoing through the woods. And every time I'd wake up in a cold sweat, I'd wonder if leaving them out there had been enough. I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd come back for revenge. And then, one day, my doorbell rang. I opened it, expecting Mike or one of the neighbors, but instead, I was staring at a stranger, a wiry man in his 50s, with slicked back hair and a piercing gaze that seemed to cut right through me. He handed me a card and introduced himself as Detective Harris. "Mr. Wilson, right?" he asked, his voice smooth and steady, like he'd done this 100 times before. Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "What's this about?" Just wanted to ask you a few questions, if you have a minute. He gave me a tight smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. About your wife, Emily. It felt like someone had yanked the floor out from under me. I knew I couldn't act too surprised, couldn't afford to show any cracks. I invited him in, offering him coffee, trying to keep things casual. He declined, which only made me more nervous. Your wife hasn't been seen in over 3 months, he began, flipping open a little notebook and making a note. Neighbors say she left for a retreat, but I wanted to get your side of the story. I shrugged, keeping my tone light. She wanted a break, you know? Needed some time to find herself, I guess. We'd been having trouble, and she thought this would help. And you haven't heard from her, he asked, his eyes boring into mine. Nope, I lied, smoothly, like I'd been practicing for this moment. Guess she's still finding herself. The detective nodded, his face unreadable. But something in his expression made my skin crawl. He knew I was lying, I could feel it. He didn't push further, though, he just asked a few more questions about Emily's last whereabouts and possible contacts before wrapping things up. When he left, I thought I'd gotten away with it. But the unease settled even deeper, like a weight pressing down on my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound felt amplified, every creak in the house like footsteps. I couldn't shake the feeling that Emily and Dan were out there somewhere, watching, waiting. And then it happened again, a knock at the door, this time in the dead of night. I grabbed a flashlight, creeping down the hallway with my heart pounding. But when I opened the door, no one was there, just a note stuck to the outside with a thumbtack, fluttering in the wind. I peeled it off and took it inside, my hands trembling as I read the words scrawled across it in a messy, hurried handwriting. You can't bury the truth, Jack. My blood ran cold. It could only mean one thing: they were alive, and they knew exactly what I'd done. Or maybe they had help. Maybe someone had found them and put the pieces together. The next morning, Detective Harris was back, only this time, he wasn't asking questions. He'd gotten a search warrant. The officers combed through my house, looking for anything that might lead them to Emily's whereabouts. I tried to keep my cool, but inside, I was falling apart. The note was still tucked in my pocket, crumpled and damp from the sweat on my palms. I knew I couldn't let them find it, couldn't let them get the faintest whiff of what I'd done. Mr. Wilson, mind explaining this? Harris's voice cut through my thoughts like a knife. He was holding a file, one that I recognized immediately, one of the fake documents I'd created to make Emily and Dan look guilty. In the chaos, I must have forgotten to destroy it. Now he was holding it up like a trophy. Looks like you were planning something, weren't you? He asked, his eyes glinting with a mix of suspicion and triumph. I don't know what that is, I stammered, but the words sounded weak, even to my own ears. After they left, I knew I couldn't stay there. The walls of my own house felt like they were closing in, every shadow a threat, every creak a reminder of what I'd done. That night, I packed a bag and checked into a cheap motel on the edge of town. I needed to lay low, to figure out my next move. But I didn't sleep, couldn't even close my eyes without seeing their faces, twisted, accusing, almost mocking me. Then, just as dawn was breaking, I heard footsteps outside my door. I held my breath, listening as they drew closer, stopping just outside. And then, without warning, the door swung open, and 2 figures stepped inside. It was them, Emily and Dan, both looking rough, worn down, but very much alive. I felt my stomach drop as they stood there, staring at me with expressions that sent chills down my spine. Thought you could get rid of us, didn't you? Emily's voice was barely more than a whisper, but it carried a weight that crushed me. Did you really think we'd just disappear? They stepped closer, their faces hard, filled with something darker than I'd ever seen before. I backed up, stumbling over my own feet until I was pressed against the wall. What do you want? I croaked, the fear choking me. Emily exchanged a glance with Dan, a wicked smile playing on her lips. We want what you owe us, Jack. You took everything from us, so now, we're going to take everything from you. Over the next few hours, they laid out their plan, and it was worse than anything I'd done to them. They'd recorded everything, their own version of events, their evidence of my setup, and every lie I'd told to cover it up. And they were ready to unleash it all, to ruin me publicly, financially, personally. Or, Dan said, his tone almost friendly, "You can disappear, Jack. Just like you wanted us to. You vanish, leave town, and we'll make sure no one ever finds out what really happened." I realized then that they didn't want revenge, they wanted control. They wanted me to live in fear, always looking over my shoulder, wondering if they'd come back. They wanted me to feel what they'd felt, to lose everything I'd tried to protect. With no other choice, I agreed. I left that night, not even bothering to pack. I got in my car and drove, heading west, without a destination or a plan, just a terrible certainty that they'd find me if I stopped. Now, I live in a different city, under a different name, always watching, always waiting for the day they decide to show up again. Every knock on the door, every unfamiliar face, makes my heart race. I have no friends, no peace, no life to speak of, just a series of empty days and sleepless nights. They let me live, but they took my life. And every day, I wonder if that's the real revenge. If you leave a comment, tell us what you think about the story you heard. It's important to us and will help us find and tell stories that you find interesting. Thank you for watching us.